And this meant previously people could claim for a self-contained property. They were now kind of being forced to share with other people. So what's happened in this policy is that the government have sort of extended what counts as a young individual, which I'm delighted at. So I'm now young, apparently, according to this government, so under 35. So what's happened now is that people under 35 who are classed as single and who have no dependents are now having their housing benefit calculated as a single bedroom in a shared house. So they're not getting very much money. What this means then is that they've had an extremely sort of significant reduction in the amount of housing support they are entitled to. For example, in London, the amount of benefit people are entitled to has been cut in half. In certain boroughs in London, it's been slashed to nearly a third. However, this policy has kind of not received that much attention, especially in comparison to something like the bedroom tax, which is frequently spoken about in the media. And what I'm arguing in this research then is that because these people are housed in the private rental sector, they don't tend to have a sort of political campaigning voice. They're kind of dispersed around the country, so they lack this sort of sense of community and political voice. So what this policy change has done, by increasing it to the age of 35, it's increased demand for an already limited pool of shared properties. So in Britain, there simply aren't enough shared properties available, especially in certain parts of the country. Also, even if a person can find a shared property, often they'll find that it's actually out of their reach, because local housing allowance is now set at the 30th percentile, which means it's only the bottom 30% of properties that are in their range. Also, the other thing is that many landlords still won't rent out to people in receipt of housing benefit. So these people are really struggling to find places to live. So what it means then is that certain people have been moved from a one-bedroom rate to a shared accommodation rate. And this means that they don't have any choice either to have to share with strangers, move back in with family or friends, or become homeless. Yet what we're arguing in this research project is that the government hasn't really taken into account the housing needs of people from protected equalities groups. So they failed to think about how people from protected groups often have very limited housing options. So what we're asking then is, how has this policy kind of created greater housing insecurity for already vulnerable groups? So there's been a little bit of research on this policy already, but this project is kind of one of the first ones to look at the impact these changes have had on groups who are protected under the 2010 Equality Act. So we're not just looking at LGBT groups, we're also looking at the effect on women, ethnic minorities, and people with disabilities. So the aims of the project then are, firstly, to assess the extent that these changes to LHA could be seen to undermine or contradict the 2010 Equality Act and the European Convention on Human Rights. So what we're wanting to think about is if we could use equalities law to make a legal challenge to some of these changes. As we've already seen with the bedroom tax, this is an avenue that many groups are pushing. So how we could use equalities law and human rights to challenge these welfare reforms. The second aim is to examine whether these changes have led to a lack of safe and secure housing options. And it's quite interesting, for this policy, like all British policy, the government have to conduct what is called an equality impact assessment. So they have conducted this assessment, and at the end of it, it's like, we need more further research on the effect this will have for marginalised groups. What we're arguing, though, is that you don't implement the policy and then think about what the effects might be. So we're looking at how this might have led to a lack of safe and secure housing. Third aim is to think about, I guess, advice seeking. So are people from marginalised groups, do they have resources that they can draw upon? Do they feel there's places they can turn to? And then the final step is just to explore what steps we can use to better support people from protected groups. So that's just a brief run through of the aims of the project. What was I going to say? So, as we're looking at different equality strands, but I guess a key part of this project is to think about those who cut across these different strands. So we're particularly looking at the lives of those who are multiply marginalised. So we're arguing then that an intersectional approach to equalities, to looking at welfare reform, is really important. So particularly at a time when there's been kind of a drastic decrease to things like legal aid, when there's current cuts to key support services. So a key part of the research then is to think or to use intersectionality as a frame for sampling. What I'm going to do today though is just present a segment of this project which is looking at the effect this changed age threshold is having on LGBT people. But also to try and begin to think about how it's not just class, it's not just sexuality, it's not just gender. When doing this project and looking for data on the effects on LGBT people, one of the big issues is that the government still don't collect data on LGBT lives and welfare reform. So again, if you look at their equalities impact assessment, it's like, well, we don't know because we haven't collected the data, so it probably doesn't have a disproportionate effect. When I put the abstract in for this conference, I was hoping we would have actually done something, but like all good research projects, we haven't yet. So what I'm going to just do is just go through a pilot interview and a bit of data from a previous questionnaire on single life, where some of these issues came up. But it's very, very much in the starting stages. We haven't actually formally started to do the qualitative data yet. So I'm just briefly going to talk about a couple of points from the pilot interviews and this previous questionnaire. So the first quote then is from a woman who's female or identifies as female, queer, in the age group of 25 to 34. And she's talking about her experiences of being moved up from the one-bedroom rate into a shared property. And she says, it's meant that I've had to live in shared houses. When doing so has been harmful to my health, in terms of the fact that I have mental health difficulties. It puts me in a precarious housing situation every year when I have to move. Having no biological family to go stay with, and all my friends settled into living situations. So here the respondent begins to talk about some of the dangers of living in shared accommodation for those with certain mental health issues. She speaks of her struggle to kind of find a suitable shared property, how these are often really short-term insecure tenancies, so she's frequently having to move, and how this has put an enormous pressure and has been detrimental to her mental health. And I think this is interesting in terms of thinking about existing research into LGBT lives, particularly looking at sort of how queer youth are kind of proportionally more likely to suffer from mental health issues than straight youth. So mental health is a key thing that's coming through in these findings. Some of the other issues we're looking at is how shared accommodation might not necessarily be suitable for certain LGBT people. So there can be problems in finding shared accommodation that's LGBT friendly and where people feel safe. So we're interested in how this idea that you force people to live with strangers, how this raises issues of both physical and mental security. And it could be in certain instances putting people at greater risk of homophobic, biphobic, transphobic abuse. The other thing from this quote here, she's noting that she doesn't have biological family to go and stay with. One of the key things that's underpinned this policy change by the government is this idea that if you're under 35, then you should just be able to return to the family home. So David Cameron has said, can't afford a home of your own, tough, live with your parents. So this is this idealised, lovely idea that at 35 you just go home. So here we have this sort of valorisation familial care and support. And what's interesting here is how the family comes in to replace the social security offered by welfare. So welfare is removed, and instead the Conservative government are promoting the family as picking up this bill. So policies such as these then kind of produce and reproduce a particular sort of heteronormative vision of the life course and the way a life should unfold. But what we're looking at in terms of this for LGBT groups and for others is how this idealization of the family home kind of ignores the fact that for many people this idea you can return is not actually always possible. So this idealization of the family home as a safe space of return doesn't fit within the reality of most people's lives, and often doesn't fit in the reality of most LGBT people's lives. So existing research has shown how parental rejection is still an issue for some LGBT people. So the parental home is not necessarily this sort of safe space of sanctuary, but is instead a space of fear and alienation. And this is sort of backed up by existing research by people like the Albert Kennedy Trust, who've researched into street homelessness and have found that 25% of the young homeless population, so people under 25, are often those, in urban areas, of those who identify as lesbian, gay, and bisexual and transgender. Other people we've spoken to, though, have kind of been left with no option but to return back to live with their parents. However, what's coming up, though, is that this return home is often quite a difficult thing, as this following extract demonstrates. Sorry, it's so long. So Fiona says, "I'm in my 30s and I'm back living with my mum. How depressing is that? I don't claim any benefits at the moment, as I can't face the idea of having to go to the job centre. So I just live here for free and I do some part-time work when I can find it. It's really hard being back here, as I never came out to my mum. She'd disown me if she knew. So I'm back home, back in the closet, and I just feel like I've failed. I'm away from London, so away from any hope of a job. I'm away from friends and my real life, and every day it just gets harder. I just feel worthless. Living here and keeping this up, it's like it was before I moved away, but worse. I can't see a way out." So Fiona had found this move back to the parental home incredibly sort of demoralising and depressing. So the entire interview with her is really flat. So what she's done is she's moved to live back with her mum, who lives in a town about 2 hours away from London. So she's talking about how her chances of finding work are now much more limited. And then she goes on to talk about how this return home has meant a return back into the closet, and how she's had to move away from LGBT community groups and support that she used to have when living in London. And this issue of LGBT housing and displacement, I think, is a really important one to address in this current context of welfare reform. So thinking about how certain areas of the country become unaffordable, and how people are beginning to be moved away from LGBT support networks. Existing research by Unison have begun to look at some of the effects that these cuts are having on LGBT people, and they briefly mentioned some of the issues around housing. So one of their respondents, who is a support worker, speaks of these issues, and what he says is, "It's harder for LGBT people to access safe and affordable accommodation near to where they can access support and advice services, which they are more likely to rely on because they may not have the support of friends and family." So as I said earlier, one of the key areas that has been affected by this policy is London. Brighton is also another area that's got incredibly high private rental rates. So again, it's affecting people here too. The final issue that we're going to begin to look at is LGBT people's experiences of kind of advice and support around housing, and whether they feel like there's places they can turn to. For example, most hostels and refuge centres and domestic abuse centres are often still designed with sort of straight people and cisgendered people in mind. So many, sort of nationwide, most of the support services still lack an understanding and resources to adequately support LGBT youth. Furthermore, and kind of worryingly, in the current period of cuts, some of the sort of key specialist LGBT support services are kind of struggling to survive. So a couple of the groups that we have been speaking with, PACE, the LGBT mental health charity, has now shut down. Broken Rainbow, the LGBT domestic violence charity, is having financial difficulties. So it's a case of if people actually have anywhere now to turn to. The challenge for this project, basically what happens is the government had a consultation asking people what they thought. They received 57 responses. Every single one of these people from charities and NGOs urged them not to implement this policy. They said that the shared accommodation rate is discriminatory and that it should be abolished. But in the name of austerity, they decided that it had to go along. And they kind of dismissed the evidence from the charity sector and from NGOs by saying that little data has been provided on how these groups will be affected other than anecdotal evidence and a general expression of concern for the groups they represent. So as I said, they don't collect quantitative data and they dismiss small-scale qualitative data. So the problem then for this research is going to be making sure that actually policymakers will listen to it, that participants' voices who are taking part in the study will be heard, and also that the government keep this in mind when they are pushing forward changes to remove housing benefit entirely for those under 21. So thinking about how there needs to be much better safety nets other than the family in order to make sure that people don't end up in such states of abandonment, and that economic cost doesn't take precedence over social cost. And that's as far as we've got to go.